There you go.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. Well, thanks ever so much to Naturalist Society for letting us do a talk about NBIS, and hopefully there'll be some questions that you might have. If anybody's watching this on the internet afterwards, please feel free to send us emails with questions or anything. Our day job is information, so we like to help where we can. So I'm going to just introduce us to you, and then Liam's going to do most of the talking, lucky for you. And you don't have to listen to me for most of the time. And then I'll finish off with some of our priorities for the future, and obviously any questions after that. So my name's Sam Neal. I head up the day-to-day running of Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service, which is the local environmental record centre for Norfolk. I won't go any further because Liam will introduce what we do. So Liam has been with us. We worked out today 3 years coming up in September. I've been here about 12 years or something. And he leads on the engagement side, volunteer recruitment and that kind of thing. So he's the communities and nature assistant. So I shall mute myself and over to you, Liam.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so today we're going to cover just what Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service does, where our data comes from, sort of things that it's used for, and then, as Sam said, some of our future priorities. So the first question is, what is a local environmental record centre? So every county has a local environmental record centre, or abbreviated LERC, and these are one-stop shops for biodiversity data collection, collation, verification and interpretation. So we hold various different records of lots of biodiversity stuff, mainly wildlife records, geodiversity information, habitat status, and protected sites information. So although we hold information about all of these things, we hold, say, habitat statuses, so what habitats are where, or where protected sites are and what sort of condition they're in, or geodiversity information for places. A lot of what we do is centered around wildlife records. So what is a wildlife record? This can be lots of different information, but it has to include the 4 W's, the 4 main components, which is who, that's who made a record, the name of the person that's found the plant, fungi, or animal, when, so the date of when it was found, what, the species name. Ideally, if you're dealing with a specialist species group where they don't have a common name, then the scientific name is great. But a lot of the times, a lot of the records we get are common species, and in which case, if it comes from, say, a member of the public, then they would only know the common name, and that's good enough, and we can get the scientific name from that. And where. Now, again, this is something that the public would often provide, maybe a postcode or a general description of the location, or perhaps even the name of a reserve. Whereas experts or people who are a bit more experienced, if possible, we'd ask for a grid reference, ideally at least 6 figures. That can just be generated online using gridreferencefinder.com. Where does NBIS data come from? So our data comes from lots and lots of different sources, but these are the main ones. So conservation organisations. A lot of people, first off, don't know about local environmental record centres, so they would contact maybe the Wildlife Trust or the RSPB and say they've seen things, and the RSPB or the Wildlife Trust would then forward that information on to us. But we also get data from license returns, so anybody who's doing, say, Great Crested Newt surveys, they have to have a license, or bat surveys have to have a license, and as part of their license conditions, they have to send through any data, any species data that they've collected throughout the year at the end of the year to us. Now, we also get data from national surveys, so the big Garden Bird Watch is a principal one, but then also Frog Spawn Spotter is another survey we get data from, and various other ones. These often come through as a big batch, maybe once a year, or sometimes even less frequently than that, but it's still really important data, and often they've put a lot of money into the survey, so you get a lot of data at one time. Now, another prime source of wildlife records for us is members of the public. Literally anybody in the county, anybody who visits the county, if they see a plant, fungi, or animal, I keep forgetting animal, why is that? Plant, fungi, or animal, they can send in the 4 Ws to us, and then as long as they send in enough information, we can get that verified by county recorders, which is the final source, and then it can go onto our database. Now, the same thing applies for county recorders. There are some here. County recorders are local experts within tax groups, and they're often quite well known locally. So people, for example, with dragonflies would go directly to the dragonfly recorder, and then annually or more regularly than that, we would get the data from the county recorders. We have the same agreement that any data that we get also goes to the county recorders annually to get verified and then come back to us before it goes on our database. Now, what our data is used for. Now, this is an extensive list. I'm going to talk about the main sort of 4 things that it's used for first, and then some of the other little projects that it's also used for. So the first thing is planning applications. And when I tell people that our data is used for planning applications, especially members of the public, this often doesn't go down well at first. People that maybe want to send in records to protect their local area don't want their records to be used to support planning applications, but that's not what it's used for. I'll get onto that shortly. It's also used research, lots and lots of research. Hand in hand with that is reports and publications, and of course, for conservation, the main goal of what we do, conservation. So how NBIS data is used for planning applications. So it starts with a developer deciding that they want to build something or they want to develop a plot of land, and they would get in contact with an ecological consultancy. The ecological consultancy would decide what sort of search they'd need to do, what data they need at the beginning of the process, and they would send in a data request to us here at NBIS. Now, we would produce maps for them, or we would produce charts and spreadsheets that include the important species in the area, protected sites, such as this map down the bottom left-hand side. This was a proposed development site, and these green shapes are the nature reserves in that area. Up the top is a very short list of some of the endangered species that was also found in that space. So we would send that back to the ecological consultant, and they would then decide from that information whether they need to do on-the-ground species surveys and habitat surveys and bat surveys and those sort of things from the information we get them, and also from what they've seen themselves. And then they would put that all together, and it goes to a planning authority. So when the planning authorities get that data or get the information from the ecological consultancy and us, they can use it to decide if a development site is suitable for development at all. So sometimes there would just be too much wildlife, or the habitat would be too important that development, they wouldn't let it go ahead. It'd be too important. A lot of SSSIs, they wouldn't let you sort of develop in there, especially if it's a big development. But they can also decide from the information what sort of mitigation may be necessary. So this sometimes would include, in the past, construction or habitat creation, bat and bird nesting boxes, and other green space creation. But also, actually no, there was no also, sorry, that was it. Going forward, there are changes to these sort of rules, and there may be options for developers to, instead of make habitat on the site themselves, they could pay into a pot to create habitat elsewhere where it's perhaps more suitable. So for example, if they were going to build a housing estate somewhere and they'd found that this could be a place where great crested newts were, the housing developer could pay into a pot to create ponds or wetlands or ideal habitats for great crested newts elsewhere away from the site. So the main thing that our data is used for in regards to planning applications is to protect and conserve the places and habitats that are most important for biodiversity. Eventually, houses need to be built, development needs to happen, and infrastructure needs to be put into place. These things are going to happen anyway, but with our data, as long as our data is the best it can possibly be, we can make sure that the right decisions are made to protect biodiversity in the best way possible. So another thing that NBIS data is used for is research. Sorry. So anybody at all can request a reasonable amount of data from NBIS for free if it's for non-profit research. So this sort of research can include many different things, but sometimes it would be looking into species that could be declining or increasing in numbers. And our data, you can have a look at how it's changed over time, how different species are being recorded over time. And for example, there, the starlings, you'd be able to see that in Norfolk, they are probably declining at the same rate they are in the rest of the country. It could also be used to see how the new invasive or non-native species are spreading across the country. And then hand in hand with that is often how some species might be affecting others that are already there. So for example, ringneck parakeets here, they nest really early in the season. So they get the first nesting sites and they may be having a negative impact on, say, starlings or great spotted woodpeckers or nuthatches. And our data would perhaps show that as they've came into a place, or our data and data from other environmental record centres would perhaps show as they've came into a place, there may have been a decline or a displacement of these other species that they compete with. Obviously, our data can also be used for other research as well. It's also used for reports and publications. So here is the front cover of the River Babingley Environmental Report, which we did recently, or not too recently anymore, but a few years ago now. And you'll obviously know of the National State of the Environment Report that went out a couple of years back. That used data from local environmental record centres. And within that, we produced maps like this here, which show the land use in the habitat in the catchment area. So you can see that a lot of that there is yellow, which is farmland, but there's some woodlands. And from that map, you'd be able to see perhaps which areas were the best to go and try survey, or which areas had the most possibility for improvement and which areas could be protected more. We also showed species matrix for that area. Which is very useful information for anybody who tries to read it or is interested in reading it. Now, how does that all come to conservation? And the answer is simple. How is our data used for conservation? And that is all of the above. All of those previous things, when put together, work hand in hand to conserve important species, important places, and perhaps even enhance nature into the future. Our data, sometimes a big part of what I do is using the data we already have to try to encourage more people to send in their records or to get more data or improve the currency of the data that we have. So some ways that's been happening recently is in the little plug here, the Biodiversity News Bulletin. So this is a bulletin we write at NBIS that goes out monthly. And this article here was actually written by a student who was doing some volunteering with us. But the map at the bottom left-hand side shows where soprano pipistrelles have been recorded in the county, and also shows where they haven't been. So that's perhaps a prompt to people who might be doing bat surveys or might know of where bats are and haven't sent them in. If they see places like here on the map where it's really white and they know that there are soprano pipistrelles there, hopefully I'll prompt them into sending their records to us. More common species that works as well. So hedgehogs, the map's a very similar idea. It just shows actually where people are, there's more records of hedgehogs. Perhaps that is down to there being more hedgehogs in urban areas, or perhaps that's down to people not being out in the farmland and seeing them at night time when they're there. But hopefully maps like this will show, for example, there's very little hedgehog recording in Great Yarmouth. So if anybody saw this map who lives in Great Yarmouth, they might think, well, I've seen a hedgehog down the road. Perhaps I can send it in to make my record count. I think a lot of time people often think that somebody else is going to do it. And this hopefully prompts them into thinking, perhaps nobody else is doing it. Maybe I should do it instead. Now, this one here was also used in the Biodiversity Bulletin, but we also share them out on our social media. So this here, instead of being an individual species, this map shows the distribution or density of fish records in Norfolk over all time. Now you can see that around some of the Broads, there's been lots of fish recording. That was actually during a couple of years where they did a heavy sort of fish surveys, but you can also see some of the rivers up the northwest of Norfolk, and some of those actually to the west of the city haven't got very many fish records, but lots of people fish there. So lots of people are already there collecting these records just without pushing them on to us. Hopefully people would see this and then send in their records to us. Now, aside from data, we also manage volunteers. So that's another big part of what I've been doing. I mentioned planning applications earlier. Sometimes once an ecological consultancy has done surveys at a site, they would have these important species records. And although it is best practice for them to send them through to us, sometimes that doesn't happen for one reason or other. So we've got some volunteers at the moment that are going through planning applications in Norfolk, finding where they've got important species records and extracting them, because it already has all of the information we need. It has what it was, the 4 Ws are already there. So volunteers going through and extracting them. We also will have volunteers in the future doing some mapping of county wildlife sites, hopefully. And as hopefully things return to normal, perhaps there'll be other opportunities for volunteers with us. Now, aside from that, I do direct some volunteers. A lot of people think that, well, they see Norfolk Biodiversity Information Service, or they've come to us from the Wildlife Trust or something else, and they think that they can do practical hands-on conservation volunteering with us. Now, although sometimes we would have volunteers for workshops and events, a lot of the time that's not the case. And what they're looking for is a more regular volunteering. So I'll then direct them to the community directory of biodiversity groups. And from there, they'd be able to find a volunteering group that's active where they are. Now, we also do workshops. Previously, we've done some seaweed identification workshops, specifically targeted for children with autism. It was a really great workshop and the children loved it. Hopefully we'll be able to do more of those things again in the future. It does kind of, them sort of things need to be face-to-face really, for them to have the same effect. So hopefully things will return a little bit more to normal and we'll be able to do some more of them. But in the past, we've also done bio-blitzes and wildlife recording days. I know some of them are actually coming up in the future, and I'm sure that you all know what bio-blitzes are, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. But what we do is work perhaps with the Naturalist Society and the county recorders and other experts to go to a place and record as much as we can at that place, either in a 24-hour period or within one day. Yeah, one day at a time. We have also helped out with some other mapping projects. So Orchards East was a project where they were trying to map or find where historical orchards used to be and see if they're still there now and what condition they're in. Now, the people who were doing that, a lot of them were volunteers and they were very keen about the surveying of the orchards, the history of the orchards, but we helped out a little bit with the expertise in creating maps for them to visually be able to see where they should be. Now, another thing we obviously do is talks and other events like I'm doing now. Hopefully I'm not talking too fast. I always talk a little bit fast, so I'm sorry if I've been going at 100 miles an hour, just sorry. But yeah, so talks and other events, that's another big part of what I do. And hopefully if you think of any groups or groups that would like a talk of this sort of style in the future or anything else about the NBIS work, then feel free to get in contact with me and I'll be happy to assist. Now, this says aside from data, but our data is also used for the Natural Capital Assets Evidence Compendium and contributes towards the Norfolk 25-year Environment Plan. Again, with our data, as long as our data is the best it can possibly be, it helps the Norfolk and Suffolk 25-year plan to be the most efficient, to have the right targets going forward. Now, I've really rallied through them. So this is Sam's slide.
Excellent. Thank you, Liam. It's a really good introduction to what we do and a really good summary of why wildlife recording is really important. And I think when it's explained the importance of an individual record and how that can go on to, as you've said, be used in planning, conservation, reporting for the state of the environment, state of wildlife report, and international reporting really hopefully can hit home how important that one record can be. So I'm just going to finish off our presentation with going through a sort of handful of key priorities going forward for NBIS. These are also key priorities for many conservation organisations across the UK at the moment. It seems like we're in a sort of, obviously aspects are to do with Brexit, but it's more than that. I think there's a real big recent shift towards really engaging with the natural environment, and I think that's really been kick-started by the climate change initiatives that have been going on, so Greta Thunberg and so on. So our priorities are quite significant and are quite numerous, and I think there's going to be quite a big change in the conservation landscape in the next 5 years. So these are just a handful of things that I think are really going to be grabbing our attention and time. So Liam's talked about protected species licenses, and those are still the case. But there's been a shift in terms of how Natural England would like to process protected species licensing. So this has a sort of general background to government wanting to reduce red tape and reducing the time it takes for a planning application to be agreed. So what has already been implemented is in much of England already is new licensing for great crested newts. Now, this is called a district level license, which is a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't necessarily have to be a district. So forget that bit, but basically it means that you have the option, and going forward, it may well be an obligation to use the district level licensing process. And this really goes to the heart of how things are going to change. This is looking at things in terms of zones of risk. So the idea is to reduce the paperwork, reduce the need for survey in areas where there is less need, but also to avoid areas of high risk. So there's a series of zoning maps, and these maps basically say red areas, a planning application for those areas will likely be rejected because it's of high importance for great crested newts. And there's high meta populations or significant populations. Amber areas will be areas where you can potentially develop, but you'll have to put in significant mitigation. And green areas will be not a free-for-all, but they'll certainly require potentially no survey work and limited mitigation that might be needed. So the implication of this is that there will be a lot more proactive work to collate the benefits of great crested newt populations and the ultimate benefits of planning applications. So essentially developers will have to put money into a pot, which organisations like in Norfolk, the Norfolk Ponds project, will be creating habitat on their behalf. They still will be able to create habitat on site or near to the site, but instead of doing mitigation which may have little benefit, money can be collated together and new ponds are being created as part of that mitigation. So it's this kind of work that's going on, really taking things in a much more broad approach. The same is being looked at for bats, although that approach has gone back to the drawing board because the modelling has not turned out the results that Natural England wanted. And I believe Natural England are looking at similar licensing for voles. So I think there's going to be a lot of this kind of work going on. And this leads into the impacts of the major sets of legislation that are coming in at the moment. So you probably will have heard that there's an environment bill, there's also planning bill, there's various other legislation that is sort of slowly going through Parliament at the moment. And these are going to have huge impacts on what we do and how we do it. So I've talked about zoning for great crested newts. You will have probably heard on the news that the government wants to turn the planning system generally into a zoning situation. So it's the same kind of idea. So it's almost like if you're in a green area, you have very limited restrictions on being able to get a planning application agreed. Whereas obviously if you're in a red zone, it's just not going to happen. Again, all to speed things up. As Liam has alluded to as well, there's a general principles in the Environment Bill around what is called net gain. And the idea is that all developments will have to provide a net gain. So the current situation is that it's down to the planning authorities really what mitigation, if any, is needed. Going forward, all developments will have to show at least a 10% gain in habitat, and preferably more, and obviously in higher risk areas that will have to be significantly more than that 10%. That goes into what is called nature recovery. So that's the current sort of buzzwords going around, and that's really what our focus is all about, is nature recovery. And I think it's you know, although a lot of these general buzzwords are going around, what it does say to us is that the emphasis now is on recovery and, as I said, net gain, rather than, as it has been in the past, about halting loss. This is now then going forward and saying we're not just about halting the loss of biodiversity, but we're actually going to have an increase and a gain in positive implications of planning and so on. Again, there's other things that are going on as part of the Environment Bill and other legislation that means that, and obviously this is significantly due to Brexit as well, there's going to be a new agri-environment or land management system. So farmers will be having a massive focus now on providing nature goods and services rather than receiving money for providing food, which in some cases has led to being given money purely to farm when it may not be sustainable to farm. So there's going to be quite a significant change for farmers and landowners. And obviously all of these bills and legislation all are wrapped around climate change, and obviously that's a big overriding pressure on everything. So again, that is starting to actually be the case. Over the last 10 years I've been working in conservation, 10, 14 years or whatever it is in conservation, climate change has been talked about so much, but actually now work is happening on the ground, projects are happening that are actually delivering work to allow species to come in for climate change, or to allow habitats or sites to be adaptable for climate change. So this work is actually happening on the ground. Ourselves as an organisation, we're putting together a 5-year plan, which is heavily influenced by, Liam's already talked about the Norfolk and Suffolk 25-year plan. And that is about Norfolk and Suffolk county councils and other partners working very, very closely together now about really pushing this nature recovery, nature recovery initiative. And that has been taken from the government's 25-year plan, which was released a few years ago. Again, all focused on nature recovery. Connected to that, for the first time, the County Council in Norfolk, who we sit within, has an environmental policy, which, as you can imagine, has big targets for climate change, including net zero by 2030, which is obviously very ambitious, but also there's some very ambitious biodiversity targets in there, and there's lots of ways that that is having to force the county council to do things very differently. So again, there's things like initiative for planting 1 million trees in Norfolk, but there's also lots of other projects like that, and there should be a lot of on the ground work starting to happen. Connected to protected species licenses, this kind of work, the new planning, zoning regulations, this is all really highlighted to ourselves and the Wildlife Trust in particular, not only the importance of recording wildlife, but the importance of monitoring. So we were having a discussion at the start of this meeting before we went live, as it were, about the Naturalist Society's work at the new Broadland Country Park and putting up malaise traps and monitoring, etc. And although that's always been useful, and many organisations such as the BTO or Butterfly Conservation have been running long-running surveys since the 1970s, etc., which have been providing the classic data that you will see that shows the decline in farmland birds or the decline in butterflies, whatever. These have been vital to our general opinion of what's going on with conservation and biodiversity. But going forward, we're really going to have to do a lot more focus on monitoring, because these new planning regulations, particularly the licenses for great crested newts, for example, at the moment, have highlighted not only the lack of great crested newt records, but the lack of repeated recording. So, for example, for the great crested newt licensing at the moment, for a site to be as a red zone, in other words, no building at all there has to be 3 consecutive years of great crested newt recording at a site with 100+ individuals recorded. Now, because of the way we get records, because of county recorders or members of the public, consultants as well, everyone really is generally just been recording once at a site, because either they've been paid to do this, or, as recorders will know, if you've recorded a species there once, you may only go back if something has changed or something is interesting, because you now know that great crested newts are in ponds on that side. But we actually, going forward, we're going to actually have to show that that is the case going forward. So one of the things we're looking at, a very light touch at the moment, is getting a few, they're mainly consultants who in their spare time are also interested in recording great crested newts, doing a bit of a pilot this year of trying to get a little group together to do monitoring of great crested newts at what we know are the key sites for great crested newts. Going forward, we want to expand that to across all the key sites, but then obviously any new sites that come up, and have a very much a monitoring network. And that would need to be the case for other species. Obviously, we've got the Norfolk Bat Survey, so that is a particularly good example of how monitoring can happen by a very collective citizen science approach, and that obviously gives us a really good baseline. Liam's talked about volunteers and engagement. We're going to have to do a lot more in terms of talking to different audiences, and that's one of the things we really want to prioritize going forward. He's talked about the seaweed workshop we did with autistic children. There's lots and lots of different groups that we really struggle to reach, and it's a classic conservation thing that you spend a lot of your time talking to middle-aged white men, whereas really there's so many more people interested in wildlife. So that's one of the drivers, but also we've talked about the highlights of the species that aren't recorded in Liam's map at Great Yarmouth, under recorded. That's a classic example where we need to engage more people with recording and filling those gaps. Those gaps could be spatial, they could be time, as I've talked about for the Newt licenses, or other kinds of gaps. And so one of the things we're going to do going forward is have a series of campaigns working with parishes in particular to really broaden out and increase that volunteer recording base down to the most local level. And finally, we're hosted by the County Council, but we're externally funded, so we're always having to look for money, I'm afraid. And so we are always trying to be involved with new projects, getting ahead of the curve, pilot projects. It's not just about the money, it's 90% about doing work that's really going to benefit conservation in England in particular. So just an example here, the images you've got, you've probably been wondering what those are. So this is an initiative that's really escalated in terms of interest in the UK in the last year, and that is what is called MOTUS. It's basically a monitoring network for particularly migration of birds and bat species. It was initiated in North America, so in Canada and the USA. And in more recent years, it's been particularly taken on by the Dutch, as you can see with all the monitoring stations on the Dutch coast, but obviously further around to Holland and Scandinavia. The Dutch are in a really good position because they get huge amount of direct government money for infrastructure for conservation and equipment. So, someone said to me the other day, they basically can just fill their boots with buying whatever equipment they want for research. It's not quite like that, obviously, but it does show you the difference of approaches. So this has really started to gain traction in the east of England. So the Norwich Bat Group and the Northeast Norfolk Bird Club in particular have shown interest in this particular initiative. And so the dots are the receiver station. So this is a receiver which has 4 antennae attached to it, which are directional. And the idea is any bats or birds that have been tagged that are within 10 kilometers of that station will be picked up, and it can tell the direction that the birds are arriving in from their migration and also leaving. This has also other benefits because it can show the expansion changes in, for example, seabird colonies, but there's also implications if you've got inland stations for looking at the changes through river valleys and so on. So we're very keen to support initiatives like this because these kinds of data are going to be providing us with information about, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got a series of arrows, and what this is showing is the already existing recording that has taken place through tagging bats in Holland in particular, and this shows the movements of those bats along the coast from the well, basically in a southwest direction. And as you can see, some arrows are going into the sea, and so those are where bats are moving, but obviously, the inference is they must be migrating across to the east of England, and that's where the receivers in the east of England comes up to pick up that kind of information. And it not only shows migration, it shows a nocturnal migration, but it can pick up all sorts of other useful bits of data and development. Recently in Holland, they've been even creating these nano tags where they've been fitting them on bumblebees. So potentially the movements of bumblebees and other small invertebrates like butterflies and dragonflies, larger dragonflies, has already been tested in the North America as being successful, so it has big implications. So it's these kind of projects that we want to be involved with, which are going to help show things like climate change, habitat, the changes in habitats and what those have caused influence on the biodiversity. So no, that's us going forward, and that's us for our presentation. Hopefully we've kept roughly to time and I haven't talked too much, and we'll be open for questions now. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Sam. Liam, I wonder if I could ask you to close the presentation and then we can all pop on our videos and unmute ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay. But thank you ever so much, both. That was an incredibly interesting talk. I have got a few questions, but I'll open the floor to the rest of our members first. Otherwise, I'll just hog the limelight.
Stunned into silence.
I have a question. It's just really about the planning applications. Is there a possibility that you could have automatic flagging up of areas of interest for so that, say, like the city council? I've got my Norwich Swift network hat on now, and it would be really useful for the planners in the city council to have knowledge of Swift zones. So we've got data from RDB Swift Mapper, but obviously that's nationwide. And I was wondering whether you have additional data that you would contribute to that, or do you take the data from Swift Mapper? And then could you create like zones that when a planning application went in, it might be even something simple, just like an extension or something, in a street where there is a Swift colony, could that just ping up a flag almost immediately? Is that sort of technology there available now?
Shall I take this one, Liam? Yeah. Yeah, in theory, yes. In reality, maybe, is my non-committal answer on this one. So I suppose there's a couple of things to do with this. So as you're probably aware, planners have got to take into account all sorts of aspects of a planning application. And as part of that decision making, they usually have a system of what they call constraints, some of which are biodiversity. We call them opportunities for obvious reasons. And so there are a certain levels of data and certain sets of data that they will use as part of that process, that will sift out applications that are causing problems in general for biodiversity. In terms of Swift specifically, I think that's something that could happen, and it would be good to do that. The question about how these things happen is the more difficult one. So again, as you probably know, there's a local plan for each district, and that's usually the best opportunity to put these kinds of zoning maps in, or what they might call strategic opportunities. And so we have in the past managed to get things in like green infrastructure. Anything that's more specific is much more difficult because they've got lots that they want to pack in there. And of course, it's the resource to actually go and lobby those districts, and they all have their plans being written at different times, and they sort of overlap, and it's So I mean, from our point of view, we'd love that to be the case, is the honest answer. The reality is, at the moment, I don't think we have the resource to be able to do that, but I'd certainly, it would be good to chat further with you about how this could happen, because you're right, there's obviously the RSPB data and the zoning mapping that they might have. We will have further SWIFT data. And we did start to look at this for example, it seems to have been the last few years less of an issue. I'm not saying it's not an issue, but we did start to put together a tool for zoning around wind turbine developments inland, implications for birds and bats, to give to planners, to, for them to use as part of their constraints mapping. So I think this is one of the things that should, and particularly with the new licensing rules and so on, I think this is where we have to get ahead of the game, really. So, in an ideal world, I think we would have a series of maps for different species groups. So swifts would be one, and there's multiple bird and bat species and so on, invertebrates, etc. So I think that would be the ambition over the next few years, because I think this is all fitting into what is being driven from government, and I think particularly with the work on the 25-year plan, that might be the best opportunity to get this kind of work on a higher priority level, and then get it through to the districts after that, because we're looking at monitoring, we're looking at target setting and all this kind of stuff, but also it's on such a strategic level that it has involvement of those in sort of positions of power. So I think that's probably the best opportunity to do this. So would be very keen to talk further, but I can't promise anything. So I'm sorry, that's quite a politician answer, but it's just limited resources and stuff. But I think we would love that to be the case. And I know parts of the country where they do have these things that do work really well and can help, because planners have got to be, masters of everything. And so they don't know what they don't get given in terms of data. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll get in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Excellent. I think, Mark, your question was next. You're on mute, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wondered, these MOTUS receiver stations, it sounds as if they're really only for organizations and big groups of people and that sort of thing. Is it possible to have one for oneself in your garden or something?
Yeah, it's mostly been small groups, actually. So, I mean, they're not cheap, but yeah, absolutely. So, although there is a sort of UK group, it's very, very loose agreement. It's really about the more receivers, the better, really. So, I mean, you would need to have, I guess you would probably need to have the right height. I don't know what height they need to be, but yeah, I think it's certainly a possibility.
So if you set one up in your garden, if you lived in the country, what sort of information would you get? What would you get? What would it look like? Would you get lists or what?
I've not seen the data myself, so it's all fairly new even to me, actually. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, it would be a sort of line for each activation of the receiver. That's the tag being picked up, and it's the obviously the tag itself, which will have the information about what species it is, the direction that it's coming from or going to, and that's about all I know in terms of what information they are picking up. I mean, it picks up 24 hours and it was downloaded and so on. So yeah, I think, I mean, it's essentially similar to what you might get for like the BTO's cuckoo monitoring, but for smaller species, basically. I don't know if that answers your question, Mark. Good, yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Dave, you're next, Dave Appleton.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering, do records that are submitted to county recorders end up in Norfolk BIS, or does that depend on the individual county recorder? And related to that, do records that are submitted directly to you go to the county recorders?
Yeah, so yes is the answer. So eventually it should, from us this year, unfortunately, it's a little bit slow, and I actually haven't sent the county recorders the data we've received yet, although that will be within the next 2 days. It's just ready to go now. On a normal year, at the end of each year, we would send in batch format our data to the county recorders, ask them to verify the records, and then send what they've had reported to them back with ours back to us verified. Occasionally throughout the year, we get people who would contact us to ask for help with identification of things, and where that's something that falls within a specific county recorders group, we'd often forward that information to the county recorder and get their opinion, so then they have that record straight away. Going forward, we're moving on to a new database, and this database perhaps would allow the process to be a bit quicker or a bit more regular, but that's something that's yet to be confirmed.
So
yeah,
if we submit records to our county recorders, there's no point in also submitting them to you, because you'd get them eventually anyway.
Yeah, the only difference is if you are like a general recorder and record lots of things from different groups and you've got them in one place, for your ease, it could be better to come to us, because then we'll obviously break them up and send them to the relevant county recorders. But if you are recording within one group, and it sounds like that's what you're doing, if you're recording just hymenopterans, for example, then you can just send that as a batch to one county recorder, and it's just as easy for you to do that as it is for it to come through us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Cass, I think you were next.
Hello. I wondered if you collect any absence data as well as presence data, because I have used that in some of my, well, master's projects in the past, and I wasn't sure if you use it, and if so, how.
Yeah, we do. I'll let, Liam might want to say more about this, but it's limited. The best absence data is obviously, well, I say obviously, for our point of view, is through a survey. So if it's not for a survey, it can cause confusion for the user of the data. Some record centres across the country don't include absence data because it can confuse the users, so particularly ecological consultants. It shouldn't, but because it's in one column that says, is it an absence or not? Is it, then it can be assumed, because it's in there, that it is a presence record. So yeah, and there is a lot of debate that goes on about the usefulness of absence records, but yeah, we do include them, particularly as I say, where they're for a survey. So I think those are the most useful absence records, so whatever that survey might be. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much covered everything I would have said as well. So, yeah.
Excellent. I think Cassie had another question as well. Sorry, I'm trying to go through the list, and then I'll open the floor again.
That's fine. So you're also talking about ideally having people that would conduct sort of more regular monitoring as well, so that you can, build up those records over time. Is there any particular training that would be available for doing that, either in specific taxa or generally speaking?
Yeah, we would hope that would be the case in the next few years. So that's likely to involve some kind of project or some funding bid for us to be able to do that. But absolutely, that will be the case. I mean, for example, with the Great Crested Newt monitoring, there will be. So the Wildlife Trust, once we've sort of tested how that might work, will be doing some training for those that are interested. So that'll be based on using their existing licenses, because people can use someone else's license when they're being trained, or that kind of thing, and hopefully getting some more people fully trained up with licenses. So it will be from different sources, and hopefully the priorities for other conservation organizations will be similar going forward. So hopefully those specialist organizations as well might be putting on, often lots of organizations like Butterfly Conservation will be putting on particular training. There are lots of courses, particularly through the FSC, so the Field Studies Council. They've been doing a lot of putting training courses on mentoring and that kind of thing. And we would like to do more of that. We've done training courses, ID courses before. The Naturalist Society, to give a plug to them, they do training courses each year. But yeah, certainly as we try and push that more, we will be looking at how these monitoring schemes might work, and then obviously we'll be then looking at how we can bring people together. And of course, one of the key things will obviously be training, definitely. So that's certainly on the cards. I can't say of anything that's definite at the moment, but that would be the intention as part of that, because obviously we're not going to expect people to either necessarily pay for it from themselves or have already those skills.
Yeah, brilliant, Sam. Lovely, thank you.
Excellent. Dave, I think you've got another question there. Appleton, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any way of accessing records. I mean, I know you said you could put a data request in, but I wondered if there was any way of accessing records online. For example, as you can with the NBN Atlas, do the records end up there so that they can be accessed there?
Yes, so our records do go to the NBN Atlas. Not so much recently, but they will be again. As I said, we've been moving over to this new database, so hopefully in the near future they will be on there as well, our more up-to-date records. But a lot of the records for the NBN Atlas in Norfolk, once you go into them, if you can see the recorder, they come from us. But also the new database that we're going to be using, or ORCA, which is the abbreviation of the new database we're going to be using. Once that's up and running, it's a more delay than a live map, but you would be able to sort of make requests much easier, especially if it is for non-profit personal use. You could make a request and then get very similar to what you actually get from the NBN actually, and a bit more information for what you're interested in for that. And as I said, as long as it's for non-profit, then that would be free for yourself. While I'm speaking to you, I see your next question is, if people are new to recording, is there a basic template recording form that people can use? And the answer is yes. I was trying to post a direct spreadsheet to this chat, but I'll just post this here. From this link, it'll take you to our website, and on there you'll see on the bottom row there's a link that says the NBIS recording spreadsheet. Click that. It's got 9 rows of information you can put in there, and that's the format we keep our data in as well. That's the format it goes to the county recorders in. You'll see the 4 W's there. They're not written as the 4 W's. They're written as common name, recorder, date, and grid reference, but it is the 4 W's. And if you was to record in that format and send it to us, it'd be much quicker for us as well. So please do that. Obviously, we take it in any format. We can put it in there ourselves afterwards. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Just to add to that as well, in terms of the NBN, so we have, as Liam says, we've got our data up there that's a few years old, and we'll be doing the same again soon when we can do. the only thing is that data is to a 10K resolution, which is not helpful for a lot of people, but gives you an idea of what we've got and the general thing, and so then people can come to us. I know it sounds a little bit archaic for us to say to come directly to us, but that is the best thing if you want records for a particular species or a particular area for your own personal interest or hobbies or whatever, because there's a sort of commercial sensitivity, not of the data itself, but of the provision of the data. So because we charge for the time for us to produce the record reports to consultants, we therefore are quite reticent to put it at full resolution on the NBN where they could get it for free. We don't really want to do that, but the reality is we obviously need to fund our activities and fund the costs of staff, and you know, because there's limited government funding, we're sort of forced into that. So it's not what we'd like. What we'd like is to publish everything on the NBN at full resolution so everyone can use it, but unfortunately the intricacies of how things work, it's not that simple, unfortunately. So that's why we advise to come direct to us, because it's the best way of getting the data.
Excellent. Next question from Spinky. I'm ever so sorry if this is a nickname and it's not your real name.
Oh yeah, it's a play on my surname. But anyway, yeah, I'm going back to the planning thing again. Sorry. I was just wondering what the resolution of this new zoning sort of maps are going to be. For example, would an ancient land end up totally in a red zone? Or would an arable field be considered poor, but if it's got like really nice field margins and hedgerows, would they be picked up as being valuable, because they are really valuable? And sort of following on from that, really, do you have any sort of like case studies where you can see any net gain from sort of mitigation measures that are put in post development? So kind of like two questions in one, really.
Okay, I'll try and remember the questions. What was the first one? Sorry,
Yeah,
I've just literally forgotten.
Yeah, so the first one was about the zoning.
Yes, the zoning.
Resolution.
So this is all really early stages. So so what happens, as most people will probably be aware, these bills are then enacted in Parliament, but the key thing really happens after that enactment, so the guidance that comes out. And this happened a few years ago with the National Planning Policy Framework that was released. It'll be very similar to that. The guidance that comes out really is key to what the influences the planners, and also what information is needed for these zoning. Just to give you a sort of heads up on these things, so the Great Crested Newt licensing in Norfolk and in many counties in England has been going for a while, and that's only just providing the information in terms of the risk mapping. So there's only just really this, well, end of last year, being implemented. So it'll be the same with the planning zoning. So hopefully, so it's a double-edged sword, because you think, oh well, this is being implemented, so it's going to happen. And the reality is it's probably going to be about a year and a half, for example, before the Environment Bill. I mean, it's actually written into some of it into the legislation when things will happen, but because they're forcing so much to happen, there has to be lots of pilots. So there's been pilots going on for net gain. So there has been mixed results, but mostly positive. In terms of the newt side, there has been a handful of applications in Norfolk, and there has been no net loss, and that's across the board in the east of England. There's been gain, and we're putting in with the habitat delivery body, the Norfolk Ponds project, that has been putting lots of preemptive ponds that can obviously be paid into. So that's a roundabout background. To answer specifics, ancient woodland will always be, unless there's something really significant that comes up, that will always be protected by law. So there's going to be no problems with those being red zones. Obviously, the European protected sites, we still don't know what's going to happen with those post-Brexit in terms of what they'll be called. So they're some of the most important sites in the country. They're also nationally protected, so we're hoping that that legislation at the very least will protect them. So obviously those sites will be protected. Would hope that sort of conservation zones, which is a bit of a misnomer if you're a wildlife person, that's for built heritage, would still be protected. So all the major things should be. If it's anything like the Great Crested Newt mapping, though, the modelling is done at a national scale and is a bit blurred. So this is where we've really suddenly realised the implications of things. So when I was talking about monitoring for Great Crested Newts, that's where that conversation with the Wildlife Trust came about, because we really had to push Natural England to even include Silverfield Newt Reserve, including the name, because of the evidence that they needed. So I think the more that we can locally collate evidence-wise, and the more that we can be prepared for when they consult and on these initiatives, and including the mapping, the better the mapping will be. That said, there's always a precautionary approach with this, and obviously in terms of the planning side, the planners will obviously still have to make the right decisions within that new framework. And what was your second question again? Sorry.
So yeah, do you have any case studies where you've got been able to monitor sort of mitigation measures put in, where you've obviously, I think you mentioned that probably a bit earlier about seeing some net gain, or
Yeah, so so I mentioned that in terms of the new licenses. So the new licenses is the only thing that's really started to be actually implemented and being able to show that kind of gain of, obviously normal planning is still in case, and the mitigation as part of that should be there, variable as we know. So there's obviously mitigation for particularly big infrastructure projects where they have to put in huge amounts of mitigation. Whether that's successful or not is of course can be debated, but yeah, in terms of the net gain, because that's not starting until the Environment Bill has been enacted. That's in pilot stages at the moment. That's what I was saying, where there's been some success, some mixed success, but generally it's tending to work. The main thing is obviously having the organisations that are able to provide that net gain habitat, so these habitat delivery bodies, which are often wildlife trusts or local groups that might come together. So I'm fairly positive that it will do more for biodiversity in the long run, but obviously like all these things, it's how it's implemented and how it's monitored that will be the key thing, really, because monitoring is not properly required in the existing planning legislation. So I'm hoping that will be as part of the zoning. So hopefully things for the developers might be quicker, but from a conservation point of view, hopefully we'll get better outcomes and actually be able to see and I think some of the I think the net gain does require monitoring, and it does require the land to be in that use for a certain number of decades. So I think there is elements of that already being put in place.
Is there resource to do that monitoring then? because it sounds like a lot of work, because it's a lot of what you've already done and just one species of great crested newt. It seems almost impossible to me.
Don't know is the answer. Yeah, I mean, you know, hopefully all of this work will do something to revive the need for ecologists at district councils, because in Norfolk and across the board that has disappeared. So, you know, there's not many district councils in Norfolk where they've got ecological expertise in-house. County council we have, and we cover some of the districts as well, to be honest, on their behalf. But hopefully this kind of requirements for monitoring, for monitoring net gain in itself, these are all going to require funding. So yes, that's what we are hoping, but there's very little information at the moment, so watch this space.
Excellent. I think the next one was Dave again.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wondered, you mentioned that records go off to county recorders for verification. I just wondered what you do with records where there isn't a county recorder. I think for some of the poorly known taxa, we don't have county recorders for everything. So I just wondered, do they just linger unverified, or do you have somebody else you can go to?
Shall I come in there then? Some of them are covered. So, well, most of them are covered by county recorders, actually. So although their remits don't officially cover them, so I'm thinking things like DIPTRA in particular, Tony Irwin, for example, will cover a lot more than his actual remit. Some species will be covered by national experts. Well, Liam, you'll know from packaging up the records, I don't think there's actually many species, if any, that we've had that are standing unverified. The lack of verification that we've had issues with is more to do with the time for county recorders to verify, or people leaving the role and it not being filled and that kind of thing. But I think I don't remember hearing anything where we've go, oh no, who do we send this to?
Yeah, I'll just chime in quickly. I think the only time in the 3 years that I've been packaging our data and sending it across to county recorders, where I've known that there's been data I've sent to a county recorder that hasn't maybe fit within their bracket, has been a couple of slime molds that have been sent to the fungus recorder, but they've been common species and he's been able to verify them, and obviously Dave Leach is trusted within that sort of field, so that's been fine. I haven't actually came across anywhere it's kind of bounced back and there's been nobody to send it to thus far. I think people who record in the lesser well-known taxon groups, perhaps they are either sending their data specifically to national schemes, or they know national experts, and therefore they get their records verified, and perhaps we actually get them already verified afterwards. Yeah, I realized earlier, Dave, I answered a question for someone else thinking it was you, but yeah, they've gone now, so I can't even cover that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Excellent. Cass, your question?
Hi, me again, sorry. It might be something you've mentioned as well previously, but I actually teach on the degrees at Eastern College, and if I wanted to get data for student dissertation projects, is this something that I would be able to either directly or get them to access for free?
Yes. So currently it would be a normal data request, which comes through via email. They fill in the form and then send an email and then get their data back, and it is completely free. Again, going forward, the new database that we're moving on to would allow this to be all online, and would allow them to get a bit better information. probably for your ease, it would be better for them to do it themselves because they need to know exactly what they're asking for.
Yeah.
But yes, essentially, not only is that possible, it's kind of encouraged, especially if we can get what they've done, any sort of feedback from what they've done, or actually be able to use that in perhaps our publications as a way of showing, here's our data, here's what it's being used for. That'd be brilliant for both us and for them.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'll bear that in mind going into next year, and I might point some in your direction in that case. So
Brilliant.
fantastic. Thank you.
I had to slide one of my questions in. I've whittled it down from, I think, about 6 to 1. So if a recorder is unable to identify a specimen to species level, will you accept photos? And in that line, are there certain groups where photos are actually needed for verification?
Yes, so some species, again, going back to fungi or other groups are even harder than photos. Some groups can't be identified photos, but if an individual found a species, wasn't sure what it was, and they couldn't identify it down to species level, as many photographs, clear photographs as possible, we can get that we can then pass on to the county recorders, who wouldn't let even know whether, unfortunately, this cannot be identified from a photograph, as has happened a few times, or they would be able to identify it, and then we'd get that as a verified record. In fact, sometimes we do encourage recorders with less experience, if they're sending in an individual record, to perhaps send the photograph in, just so we can be 100% sure.
I'd add to that that people can submit their photos to websites such, well, the two most common ones are probably iSpot and more recently iNaturalist, which is an American similar version. And the idea with those is that the community that's on, for example, iSpot, will help you in your journey of understanding and learning, so you can hopefully get from species from family or genus down to species level, because there's lots of experts and there's lots of people that are just starting off as well. So those are good ways of learning, interacting from others, and also getting your increased understanding. So I'd encourage people to use those kind of resources as well.
I'll add to that too. We do also have Norfolk Wildlife on Facebook. There's lots of different species identifying groups as well. I'm part of the fungi one. And then obviously the Natural Society has a Facebook page too. So if anyone wanted to use that, and I lied, I have one more question. I'm very, very sorry, because I don't want to miss this one. So do you accept historical records? And if so, how far back can these records go to still be used for inquiries and to be used on the database?
Okay, so yes, we do accept historical records. I need Sam's help on this one. I'm not sure how far back as standard at the moment we include in the data we send out, but I know that going forward, people will be able to request data for, well, as far back as have it, or select periods of time within that period. So even data at the moment, sometimes we'd receive like records that have been identified from museum specimens from hundreds of years ago, and they still go onto the database, and they're perhaps as important as some of the records that we got yesterday, especially where they show a species where it used to be and then isn't anymore, or perhaps maybe still is and needs to be looked for. But yeah, hopefully Sam can help me with how far as standard we can send that out.
Yeah, so currently we send out the last 15 years worth of records. That's the records with the last 15 years as the date, not necessarily that was sent in the last 15 years. Going forward, as Liam says, that will be broadened out. I mean, it will actually be reduced in terms of, by default, there'll only be 10 years that people will see straight away on the interactive map that they'll receive, but they'll be able to actually move the little drag thing across, and it'll allow them to see more, because in general, so the sort of the standard, the ecological guidance, so the sort of SIEM guidance for practitioners is 10 years, but there's a lot of debate about that. and some consultants will want, or other users will want data further back than that. Of course, for research purposes, all data is useful. So people may have heard of biodiversity audits that the UEA has been doing. They may, and in some cases, look at all records, or they will certainly look at much further back than that. Some record centres, for example, will provide data from the 1970s onwards. So that sort of seems to be a good standard for when recording really took off in a very sort of serious way. But yeah, all records are really important, and you know, the thing is, you just don't know what will be important in the future in terms of our understanding from a research point of view, from, you know, climate change or whatever it might be. So we need all of those records, and they're all equally important, even if it's more recent ones that are a priority for planning. That doesn't mean from a conservation point of view or research point of view, old ones aren't.
Fantastic. Thank you both ever so much. I'll open the floor for one final question before we let our lovely speakers go and enjoy their evening. Did anyone have one final burning question to ask?
I could say that the recording pages on our Norfolk and Norwich Naturalists website haven't been changed since 2016, when I first put them on there. And I wonder if they still represent what's required, because as you might know, I spend some time on doing these things. I don't get any feedback at all about it.
I think in general, the overall gist of it is, yes, is relevant. I think there's details, and that's the same with ours as well, to be honest with you, in some parts that needs updating. And I think particularly as we get further on with a lot of these initiatives that's going on at the moment, I think that's when it'll be a good time to relook at these things. And we're going through a process where we're engaging with county recorders in particular about sort of data exchange and stuff like that. So I think those will be the time period. So possibly from next year onwards would be a good time to update those things. But I think as long as they're pointing to the right people, pointing to us, or pointing to the right interest groups, then that is a good start, because all of that data does eventually come back to us anyway. But yeah, it's difficult to keep these things up to date, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
No problem.
Fantastic. And Carl's just mentioned, of course, that this recording will be available on the website. So if anyone does need to look for a resource, that is available there. I just wanted to thank you both for being such fantastic speakers, for joining us this evening, and to all of our lovely attendees for asking such wonderful questions, really, and helping really delve further into the presentation. So thank you ever so much. Some claps, and I'm going to send the full feedback of what we discussed in the conversation for you guys as well, because you might find that useful later.
Thank you ever so much, and thanks for brilliant questions. They were really good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. If you do have any follow-up questions, then feel free to contact us directly going forwards, and we'll be able to help you out directly. Brilliant. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.